Another week, another round of the Twitter files. This time, journalist and writer Alex Berenson reports that to funnel his demands, PFIZER board member Scott Gottlieb used the same Twitter lobbyist the White House uses to encourage Twitter to hide posts challenging his company's massively profitable COVID jabs. In August 2021, Gottlieb emailed Todd O'Boyle, a senior manager in Twitter's public policy department, that this tweet from a former FDA commissioner named Brett Giroir, apologies if I got that name pronunciation wrong, claiming that natural immunity was superior to vaccine immunity, was that claim was corrosive and might go viral. Twitter then put a misleading tag on the tweet, which greatly reduces its distribution if it can be seen at all.
Later, in October 2022, Scott Gottlieb claimed on Twitter and CNBC that he was not trying to suppress debate on the mRNA jabs. According to Berenson, these files prove that Gottlieb, board member at a company that has made $70 billion on the shots, did exactly that. Yeah, Robbie, this seems very damning to me. First of all, the original email that he reaches out to Twitter about saying that it was corrosive, isn't the argument that he should be making that it's factually inaccurate if it is, to prove that it
He was worried that anyone would see this right. And it would cause them to not get vaccinated. And in this case, you can draw, because he's a former FDA commissioner. He's also a contributor to CNBC, so he talks about the vaccines and COVID, et cetera, offers his expertise. But he's also on the board of PFIZER. Mm-hmm. And PFIZER obviously has something to benefit from financially. Mm-hmm. More people get vaccinated, and more importantly, if vaccines get required for certain things. No, the only point I was just trying to slip in there is that if you are making an argument to a tech company as to why something is misinformation, the first thing you should have to prove is that is in fact false, not just that the idea that something is corrosive abstractly. The case that you have to make is that there's something inaccurate with the statement. And maybe I don't know what the state of information was at the time, but I suspect the fact of the matter is the information that he was reporting on or trying to diminish was from a medical professional. Yeah, this tweet. So this is not from a crank, from a former FDA person, Brett Giroir, who tweeted, "It's now clear COVID-19 natural immunity is superior to vaccine immunity by a lot. There's no scientific justification for vax proof if a person had prior infection. CDC POTUS must follow the science. If no previous infection, get vaccinated." That was August 27, 2021.
So there's obviously a perfectly reasonable public health reason to want people to get vaccinated as opposed to getting that immunity through catching COVID, when at the time especially, people were going to the hospitals were overrun, people were dying, there were long-term health consequences from getting the vaccine protection through actually surviving the virus. However, instead of trusting the American public and just making that case, saying, okay, look, if you got COVID, maybe you don't need a vaccine dose, at least not right now, because you have this immunity for a period of time, they just lied and tried to suppress this kind of information. And the fact, I gotta say, this story, crazy. You've got pharmaceutical insiders reaching out to tech companies to suppress information that is scientifically validated. This seems like the kind of story that historically the left should be running with. It's people doing misinformation for the profit motive and using their leverage and influence within the government and with these tech companies to advance that cause. And somehow this is still not a mainstream issue.
Yeah. So Alex Berenson, the person responsible for this Twitter files dump, is someone very well known now, who himself was banned from social media platforms for allegedly spreading misinformation. He's been a very castigating kind of anti-vaccine voice. Suggesting, I think in several cases, that the vaccines are both ineffective and dangerous. I've criticized him before. I disagree with a lot of his claims, although I will say one kind of central claim that I think I argued with him on cable news when we were on together about, he ended up being right. He said the vaccines would not, in the long run, substantially reduce cases. And, he was labeled the wrongest man of the pandemic by the Atlantic magazine. And again, I think, and I continue to think he was wrong about some things, but he was less wrong than I thought at the time. And I have to give credit for that. I don't know.
That's an interesting question. I don't know how much of that also has to do with the fact that part of those initial claims, as I understood them, about the role the vaccine would play, required a certain percentage of the population to get vaccinated, and also required globally a percentage of the population to get vaccinated. Because what we're seeing now is all of these variants that are less susceptible to the vaccine, in part, are able to germinate in different parts of the world because people haven't had access to the vaccine. Something like, almost nobody in places like Africa have had real access to the vaccine in a meaningful way. So I'm not sure, to what extent he's right, because we didn't take other kinds of measures.
Have they had significantly more deaths as a lack of access to the vaccines?
Well, no. I mean, there's a lot of things that are going on in Africa. But yeah, I mean, there's fewer of the certain kind of comorbidities that we have here, obviously. There's also some reporting issues. There's also, depending on where you are in the country, less density.
What do you mean Africa has fewer comorbidities? Do they?
I mean, in terms of diabetes and obesity and things like that, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But there are there are other diseases that are
but that are not necessarily but not in the same. The number of people who are HIV positive, even in very HIV positive countries, I think at some point there was a stat about South Africa being 1 in 5 or something like that, at least in a certain age group. I believe that the obesity and diabetes rates are even higher than that in the United States of America. So
it's interesting.
Yeah.
One other thing I want to say on the subject. What was it? Oh, Scott Gottlieb himself. So Scott Gottlieb was the FDA commissioner in the Trump administration. So he is comes from conservative policy circles, and he was someone that I think a lot of conservatives and libertarians were maybe cautiously optimistic about because it seemed like he had a deregulate, not microman, that he'd be someone to say, yeah, we could that's something I complain about all the time. We could let drugs from Europe that have been approved in Europe and are totally safe and work really well for decades. Maybe we could have them in the country. He ended up being, I think, very frustrating for people of my ilk for basically defaulting toward no, government knows better. Let's take our time. Let's not approve things. He was very passionate about anti-smoking, he's a crusading anti-vaping figure.
Interesting.
Which many people think is actually counterproductive to the cause of reducing smoking because some people vape instead of smoke, and vaping some people say, can help you quit smoking. I just searched our archives at Reason Magazine, where we've been very critical of Scott Gottlieb for a good Scott Gottlieb anecdote. And so apparently he was speaking to the Manhattan Institute in 2017. The Manhattan Institute being a very conservative, free market conservative think tank. And he was asked about his plan to require cigarette manufacturers to lower the the amount of nicotine in the product. And someone in the audience at this talk said, you want to take the nicotine out of cigarettes? Do you also want to take the alcohol out of booze? And he responded, well, the FDA does not regulate alcohol products. And this person said, well, thank God for that. Which just goes to show you, even though a member of a Republican administration came from this policy background, it was tremendously disappointing to a permissive, laissez-faire, free market view of how the FDA should operate.
That's an interesting story because it does point to the fact that it is increasingly difficult to predict where people are going to come out on issues as they come up these days based on their ideological priors. And at a certain point, I think that it's healthy because for too long, folks have been able to rely on there's a D or an R behind this person's name, and therefore I'm going to commit to all of their beliefs. And this is forcing people, I think, to think a little bit more on their feet and be appropriately critical of the media that has misled people a great deal. And it also puts the onus on the media to prove its worth in a way that I think it's been not doing and resting on its laurels for some time. So hopefully something good will come out of this. We'll continue to cover this story as it unfolds, and we'll have more Rising for you right after this.